Thank you very much, Terry, and good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming back. We've got a ways to go today. I would like to complete the presentation about Montana's early newspaper history and then talk about Thomas Francis Meagher, and if there's time, start at least with Senator Burton Wheeler. I'm not sure how far we'll go, but we'll go as far as we can. A couple of preliminary things before I get started. I do encourage your questions and comments, disagreements, whatever. You can either put them on the chat or I'll pause periodically. You can unmute yourself and we can discuss. I don't see the computer necessarily as a barrier. It's just a way of interaction, so I would encourage your participation. If you have questions or discussion between classes, I'm available at paul3707@aol.com. Just send me an email and I'll respond. My book is available. The student MOLLI price is $29 a copy. Send me a check to 2555 North Price Road, number 1-2015 in Chandler, Arizona, 85224, and I'll send you a book. We were discussing the fact that the book is reviewed in the current issue of the Montanan magazine, published by the Alumni Association. So it's good that the word is out there. Several detective things before I get started, based on our discussion last time. Questions were, what was the status of Professor Merriam's book about the history of the University of Montana? That was one. And the related one sort of is, what is the status of President George Dennison's unfinished book about the history of Montana? I've tried to pursue that, and I think I have somewhat definitive answers. I first was led to one of Professor Merriam's granddaughters, who she and her cousins have the literary rights to Merriam's book. And she said that she spoke with someone, the vice president at the university, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and nothing came of that. And she was somewhat interested in republishing the book if anybody was interested in it, but she didn't appear to be too interested in moving that forward. I was then led to Ashby Kinch, who is apparently the dean of the graduate school at the university. I was just on the phone with him this morning. There is a University of Montana Press. It doesn't have a press, but it can publish. It publishes a little bit. He expressed doubt that the Merriam book would have a sufficient market to be worth the cost of republishing it. He expressed interest in doing it if anybody was willing to pay for it, in effect. But that's his position. He's aware of the book. He might be interested. There'd have to be a way to finance the publication of it, and that's uncertain. With respect to the Dennison book, he said that the manuscript and the research notes are in the archives at the University Library. There has been discussion, but nothing happening in terms of finding someone to complete that book. And so that's just sitting there. So if any of you want to volunteer to complete that book, it's available to be completed. He thought that Dennison had started to write about Professor Elrod and then was going to the university generally. Dennison did publish the book about Professor Elrod. I referred to that last time, but my understanding was that what Dennison was going to do was to write a book that would update the Merriam book with the history of the university's more recent years, and that's something that he just did not complete. He completed the book about Elrod instead. A couple of other books and another question. Someone asked whether William Clark had ever served in the Civil War. And I think I had said, well, I didn't know. I hadn't heard about that, and the timeline that I had read in the in the Dedman and Newell book that is referred to in my book doesn't leave time for Clark to have served in the Civil War. But there's a book called by William Mangum, W.A. Clark and His Tarnished Family, which was published in 1939. I have a copy of it. It was a sensational book about the lives of Clark and his family. The Clark family tried to buy up all the copies, and it was republished in 2007 by Old Butte Publishing. It's available. It's a photostatic copy of it, and the objective information in Mangum's book, for the most part, tracks objective information that I have found in other sources that I've referred to. But there is one place where Mangum says that Clark served in the Civil War on the Confederate side, and sometime between April 1861, autumn of 1862, and quoting Mangum, he says, but in later years, he spoke of it only to a few intimates. Why he left the war will perhaps never be publicly known. He may have deserted or he may have been discharged, but he was not disabled. In his reminiscences, he had chosen to ignore this period of his life. And then Mangum says, in the autumn of 1862, Clark was driving a team west, headed for Colorado. Now, I look back at the Dedham and Newell book then that I'd relied on before, and they dispute that claim. They say that Clark enrolled at Iowa Wesleyan in 1860. He was there until the spring of 1862. He left to join the Colorado Gold Rush then. There's no record that he ever served on either side in the Civil War. And so they flatly take issue with that. But there's another part of another pairing here between Mangum's book and a book called Twilight Man by Liz Brown. One of the people who Mangum talks about is William Clark Jr., who succeeded to seniors' interests in the Butte Miner and other newspapers after Clark died. That refers to a genteel life of dissipation in Los Angeles, but Mangum is much more specific. He goes on into various homosexual relationships that William Clark Jr. had, which are quite specific and sensational. There's a new book by Liz Brown, who is a shirt-tail descendant of William Clark, called Twilight Man, which goes into more detail about those relationships. And so there is that part of the story that I won't get into in detail, but it's there if anybody's interested in following the life and career of William Clark Jr. So let's talk about newspapers. As I see it, there are several stages in the evolution or progress of Montana's newspapers between 1864 and 1959, when the Anaconda papers were bought by Lee Enterprises. In looking at the book by Swybold and in my chapter, there's just a lot of detail about who was buying whom and what was doing what. And it's easy to get lost in the forest for the trees. But I think the way to understand it, and the way I'll try to explain it, is that there is a series of stages that Montana's newspapers went through over a period of time between 1864 and 1959 that run counter to the idea that there should be a free and independent press. Part of what the colonial newspapers in the United States were about was individuals who courageously called out the royalty and defended their particular points of view. And that's what the First Amendment to the Constitution is about, is to protect the ability of independent writers and editors to be critical of the government. And that's how the press started out in Montana. As I've covered in pages 2 and 3 of my chapter, there were a lot of independent newspapers, beginning with the Montana Post, which was published in Virginia City. There were papers in Helena Herald, a Republican newspaper. The Rocky Mountain Gazette was a Democratic newspaper, but they weren't controlled by those parties. It was just that those editors had that point of view, and they were, presenting their point of view and really being very critical of the others. And there were a number of other independent newspapers, both dailies in the major cities and weeklies in the smaller cities and counties. But that began to change when William Clark together with other investors, bought the Butte Miner in 1881. Before, that paper had been a Republican weekly that was owned and published by a man named James Mills, who had originally started the Virginia City paper, but Clark turned it into a Democratic-oriented daily newspaper to promote his own point of view and increase the influence that he had in terms of the public conversation. So that starts a second stage where papers are bought for the purpose of promoting the political point of view of their owners, who are themselves actors in the economic political situation. So Clark, by 1888, then, the Butte Miner was the Montana Territory's preeminent newspaper, Democratic voice, and that lasted until 1889, when Marcus Daly decided that he really needed a newspaper. At that point, this was before Amalgamated came into the picture. Daly was, actively involved on behalf of the Anaconda Company at that time, and he wanted to have a forum to express his point of view, and also to have, in connection with the coming battle as to which city would be the capital city of Montana. So Daly starts the Anaconda Standard then. He brings in as an editor a man named John Durston, who had moved to Montana from New York. He had been a Republican, had been a Republican newspaper in New York, but he was a professional editor. He received assurances from Daly that Daly would support the paper, even though there might not be enough circulation to justify a daily newspaper in Anaconda. And immediately then, the Anaconda Standard established a news bureau in Butte. It published daily news about Butte, and it began competing with the Butte Miner and a paper called the Intermountain, which was a Republican paper published by Lee Mantle, who was also a political actor in Butte and in Montana politics generally. So this is like scissors, rock, paper in a way. The Standard attacks the smoke in Butte because that's something that Clark is promoting. Clark has smelters in Butte, and the Standard is criticizing that. The Standard criticizes the fact that the Republicans are obtaining illegal profits from Indian contracts, and but it comes to a head then in the battles for which city will become the state capital after Montana becomes a state. Initially, the Butte Minor supported Butte before the 1892 election. But then when Butte did not make the cut to the final two cities, Clark shifted his support to Helena and began to acquire newspapers to support his position that Helena should be the capital city. Daly also bought papers to support his point of view that Anaconda should be the capital. And there was an all-out war between the Clark papers and the Daly papers as between Helena and Anaconda. As it relates to Missoula, the Missoulian was owned by a man named Andrew Hammond, who had timber interests. He had entered into a partnership with Daly to provide timber for the mines in Butte, but Hammond and the Missoulian loaned the paper to Clark to promote Helena over Anaconda. And I think this was part of the arrangement then under which Missoula was rewarded with having the University of Montana located in Missoula when Helena was, or actually before Helena was selected to be the state capital. So Helena wins the election. There is a typographical error at page 6-6. The vote count, I say, was 22,074 for Helena. It was 27,024. So you can mark that correction. I apologize for the miscount. So that established the proposition that newspapers could be weaponized to be used by proponents of opposing point of view. The next major round in that was the election of 1900, where by this point, Anaconda had been acquired by Amalgamated. Clark and Heinze combined to elect a favorable set of legislators who would elect Clark to the Senate. They were opposed by Daly with the Anaconda Standard and Mantle through the Intermountain. And again, both Daly and Clark bought or controlled newspapers to in that election. The issue there, in part, was the fact that Amalgamated had purchased Anaconda, and Amalgamated could be attacked as a terrible, wicked trust from New York associated with Standard Oil. So, Clark and Heinze won that election with the result that Clark was finally elected to the Senate. But when he was elected, he then broke with Heinze, and his papers began to support Anaconda's point of view, leaving Heinze with his papers. One was the Reveille, which had started in about 1898, and then there was a paper called the Evening News, which Heinze started before the 1904 election. So that is a stage then where there are competing political forces who own or control competing newspapers who attack each other and attack the other side. But after the 1900 election, Amalgamated began to consolidate its ownership or control of newspapers. That reached Heinze's papers failed in about 1906, 1909, 1910, and by then Amalgamated simply had control of more than half of the daily newspapers in Montana. There is a kind of a footnote here, or an aside, that comes up in the context of the Heinze's evening newspaper. There was a young reporter on Heinze's paper named E.G. Leipheimer, who stayed with the paper until it failed. He then went with the Anaconda Standard in Anaconda, and after a number of years, I've tried to determine when it was, but it's probably about 1925, 1926. He became the editor of the Anaconda Standard after Durston had retired, and he was the one who announced to the Butte Minor newsroom staff in 1928 that the Butte Minor had been sold to Anaconda, and he was going to be the editor of it. As there was going to be a merger, and he was going to be the editor of the Montana Standard, which resulted from that merger. Leipheimer remained the editor of the Montana Standard for about 20 years. And here I'm just deliberately skipping a lot of history to stay with Leipheimer. He retired in about 1948. His grandson, Eddie Leipheimer, whom some of you from Butte may know, was a high school classmate of mine. Ed Leipheimer Jr. Had a Chevron gasoline distributorship in Butte. I knew the Leipheimers because our families went to the same church, and Eddie was a high school classmate of mine. Eddie gave me the paper by E.G. Leipheimer, which he wrote, I think, in about 1948 about Butte. And I with Eddie's permission, I've included that as an appendix to the chapter in your electronic materials. I don't want to get into that in detail, but it's a remarkable thing because it takes the history of Butte and looks at it in a very, very favorable way, which might or might not be factual. It's certainly all in the point of view. I've asked Eddie if he knew why that paper was written. As far as I know, it was never published. I have a typewritten copy of it that I've attached to the material, but it was obviously written about the time that Leipheimer retired as editor of the Montana Standard. It refers to the recently announced Greater Butte Project, which occurred in September 1947, as we've already discussed. And so it's a very interesting thing, and it really is a collector's item that I have Eddie Leipheimer's permission to share with you. So there's that. Does anyone have any comments so far before I move ahead? All right. During the early 1900s into the 1910s, there were two new trends that occurred. One was the emergence of socialists in politics in Montana who had a newspaper called the Montana Socialists, and the other was the beginnings of the progressive movement. The existing papers really opposed the socialists, and the paper was destroyed. The progressives didn't do it well either, but this was an instance where these competing interests competed with what was beginning to be the copper press, and unsuccessfully. And when you look at this history in general, I would say that this is like Into the Woods, but on a statewide level. The papers don't exist in a vacuum. The papers write articles, editorials about what's going on in the state, in the history, events that are occurring. And so to give this any sort of context, you have to go back to look at the events that were occurring in the state, and then see what was happening in terms of the newspapers' coverage and treatment of them. So during this period of time, again, as Heinze closed his papers, Anaconda consolidated control of the papers that it had. Clark continued with the Butte Miner, but he no longer had much of an interest in Montana politics. The paper supported Anaconda, and so it had to be counted on that side of the equation. But there was as another example, and I cover this at pages 13, 14. The Anaconda smelter produced a lot of smoke, which went down the Deer Lodge Valley and damaged farms and ranches that were in the Deer Lodge Valley. Farmers filed a class action lawsuit in federal court to abate the smelter smoke. And that went on for years, and the Anaconda Standard criticized those farmers for doing that. Finally, the lawsuits were dismissed because the judge found that Anaconda had done an adequate job in taking care of the pollution arising from its smelting operations. But again, that was an instance where the Anaconda Standard, the Montana Standard, not the Montana Standard, the Anaconda Standard supported the Anaconda Company's point of view. There's a man named Joseph Dixon, who is an interesting character in Montana history. Dixon had bought the Missoulian newspaper in 1900, and he gained control of it in 1907. He hired Arthur Stone, who later became dean of the journalism school at the University of Montana, and Dixon was elected to the Senate in 1907. He succeeded Clark when Clark chose not to run again. He was a senator for one term, and then was defeated because he had become too progressive. He was the national chairman of the Bull Moose campaign for Theodore Roosevelt, and he was, at this point, Amalgamated opposed him, and he was defeated. He sold his interest in the papers to people who he thought were independent journalists, but were really apparently fronts for the Anaconda Company in 1917. But when in the 1920 election, Dixon ran for governor against Burton Wheeler, and at this time, Wheeler had antagonized the Anaconda Company, as I'll get to later, that the Anaconda Company supported Dixon, its paper supported him, really trashed Wheeler. So Dixon was elected governor. Dixon then proposed tax policies which would adversely affect Anaconda. And so the Anaconda papers turned on him, and he was defeated for re-election in 1924. So the paper's allegiances shift in relationship to the politics of the time. Moving ahead, by the 1920s, Anaconda had pretty much achieved a dominance in the state's daily newspapers. The only exception really was well, the Great Falls Tribune was an exception at one point. The Butte Miner, which the Clark family still held, was another. And when Clark died in 1925, William Clark Jr. became the head of the Butte Miner. That was not sold until 1928. So William Clark Jr. used the Butte Miner to attack the Anaconda Company. He started 3 other newspapers in about 1928 that also were independent, that attacked the Anaconda Company. But he decided to, well, the Butte Miner was sold to the Anaconda Company in 1928, and Clark stopped publishing his papers in 1929 because they were losing money and he couldn't afford to keep them going. So at that point, then, the combination of the Anaconda having the newspapers consolidated and concentrated to defeat Dixon during the 1924 election, the elimination of the Clark newspapers as competition in the 1928-29, by then Anaconda really did have control over nearly all the daily newspapers in Montana. And so it was a different situation then. It wasn't as though there were competing interests that the Anaconda papers could oppose. Anaconda was in control, and the papers were in control, and the editorial policy of the papers was standardized, and the Montana Standard became the lead newspaper. E.G. Leipheimer was the editor of the Montana Standard, and he was the conduit conveying policy from Anaconda through the Montana Standard to the other newspapers in the Anaconda group. And that went on for about 30 years, from 1929 until 1959, when the papers were sold. I had a Montana Standard paper route when I was a kid in Butte. For those of you who are from Butte, I picked up papers at the old Milwaukee Railroad Station, which was KXLF-TV, and carried them off at 4 a.m. through the snow, up the hill on Colorado Street. And it never occurred to me what was in the newspapers at that time. I simply had a Montana Standard paper route. But what Swybold says is that and this is at page 6-22, the papers were expected to publish nothing harmful to the company's image, to publish favorable news prominently, to confine editorials to non-controversial items. But historian Ross Toole says the company simply dropped a great gray blanket over Montana. So there was no controversial editing. The papers supported Anaconda, reported favorably on what it was doing. They did not publish things that were harmful to Anaconda's interests, and this kind of went on. After a while, and they kept that ownership relatively secret. They did not disclose that there was a holding company called Fairmount Investment, and then another one called the News Publishing Company that had the ownership of these papers as an Anaconda subsidiary. That was disclosed publicly when Fairmount sought approval from the Federal Communications Commission to have a television station radio station, KFBB. They had to disclose who the owners of Fairmont were, it was disclosed that what those interests were, and at that point, Anaconda withdrew its application because there was going to be a public hearing that would really disclose that, and so Anaconda backed off trying to acquire KFBB. And then finally, after Con Kelly died in 1955, and there was an article in 1956 by a Billings lawyer named John Schultz called Montana's Captive Press, which criticized Anaconda not so much for owning the papers, but publishing bad newspapers. They had become dull, colorless, devoted to the status quo. And finally, the company figured out that they really didn't need to be in the newspaper business. They shouldn't be in the newspaper business. They weren't making a profit on the newspapers. They were beginning to get increasing criticism for owning the papers. And so a process then occurred which led to Lee Enterprises buying the papers and created a situation where there was then an independent press, which I guess still exists with Lee, but at least it's independent of whatever the Anaconda company had become. And there's a comment that Sweibold makes, which I've quoted at page 6-25. When the papers were acquired by Lee, the result was like freeing men from slavery. The editors and reporters were finally free to publish news and write editorials as they saw fit in a responsible way. So that's the story of how the newspaper situation in Montana evolved. It's really unusual, it's unusual that one company could control the press in a state like Montana, but Anaconda's interests had evolved from simply controlling the situation in Butte, Anaconda, to controlling the state legislature because of interests in opposing workers' compensation improvements and preventing increases in taxation on mines and other property. And so they needed to have a statewide reach to present their point of view to Montana voters who elected the legislatures. And so that's how that evolved and continued. Let's see, there's a comment here. Schultz's article appeared in the Montana Opinion, an underground newspaper published by Schultz, K. Ross Toole, and a third man whose name I don't remember. Right, the reference I have, let's see, is it was published in something called the Montana Opinion. Maybe that's the underground newspaper you're referring to. And that's quoted in the Sweibold book at page 302. So it was influential, I think, whether the paper was underground. It was, simply a turn in public opinion, so that encouraging Anaconda to get rid of papers that it probably didn't really want to keep anymore anyway. Did ACM also control rural weeklies? Well, there was a point particularly with reference to the 1924 election to defeat Dixon, where the Anaconda Company and Montana Power Company placed series of ads in these weekly newspapers and got favorable publicity in that way, and may have influenced editors to support them in the specific instance of defeating Dixon, who was trying to enact tax policies that would have adversely affected Anaconda. So they didn't control. I don't think they didn't control the weeklies so much, but they owned or controlled the dailies in Montana's major cities, except for the Great Falls Tribune. And of course, that's where the people were for the most part. And so they could dominate public opinion and publish favorable stories in that way. Any other questions, comments? I assume that the Lee Enterprises still owns these papers in Montana, and I don't read them, but I assume that they're objective and entertaining and well written. But the question I have through all of this is, well, what was the University of Montana Journalism School doing through all of this period of time? A.L. Stone was the dean of the journalism school. The journalism school was pumping out journalism graduates who became reporters, editors at these papers. No one really complained, I guess, at least not visibly. Maybe it wouldn't have done any good. But surely people like Stone knew that this monopoly existed, and that the result was that Montana was not getting objective, fair, critical newspaper coverage of, particularly of things that affected the Anaconda Company. Why was the Great Falls Tribune independent? I've forgotten who owned it before. I think it was Clark that had bought it and owned it for the 1900 election. But after that, Clark didn't need it anymore, and it was returned to its prior owners, and it continued to be an independent newspaper as the result. I think maybe another part of the answer to that is that after the 1900 election, Anaconda didn't need to own the paper so much anymore, certainly after the 1904 election, because it already controlled the politics in the Montana legislature, and if Clark owned it, he was not interested anymore in it really, and could return the ownership to an independent status.
I think for a while there were two newspapers in Great Falls. The other one was called The Leader. And I'm not sure if those were rivaling Copper Kings that owned those or not. But The Leader sort of fell out of publication sometime in the 50s, I think, maybe later.
Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about Thomas Francis Meagher. You can say about Meagher that he's maybe just a historical footnote. He was in Montana for less than 2 years, from September 1965 until July 1st, 1867. He was an acting territorial governor. He ran into opposition with the Montana vigilantes. He couldn't accomplish very much, and I didn't know anything about him really until I happened to find the book by Timothy Egan in an airport bookstore, and I thought it was interesting and read it. But Meagher was really incredible. He was only 43 when he died. And he, in that respect, he's like Heinze, who packed an awful lot of living into 43 years. You have to consider, I think, in looking at Meagher, not just who he was in Montana, but who he had been and what he had done in his earlier years to get him to the place where he was in Montana. And that history is really very interesting. And I've followed Egan's book in summarizing that history. And after I wrote the chapter, and it was too late to edit it, I discovered that there were two other books about Meagher that I do intend to include if I ever have time to do it. One is by Paul Wiley, who was a retired Montana lawyer. It's called The Irish General, published in 2007. And then there's another one by an Australian author, Thomas Keneally, who wrote a book called The Great Shame, which is more generally about Irish immigration, not just to the United States, but to Canada and Australia, and how that immigration affected those countries. So those I would recommend the three of those books if you're really interested in Meagher and the general subject of the Irish immigration. There's a question here. What year did ACM divest itself from the newspapers? They were sold in 1959. I said after a period after Con Kelly died in 1955, the Schultz report came out. The Anaconda management decided they really didn't need the papers anymore, and so they found what they considered to be a suitable buyer, which was Lee Enterprises, and were able to sell the papers to them, which they considered to be a responsible way to get out of it. Meagher must have been, well, I've included in my chapter a summary of the history of the relationship between Ireland and England, going back to the beginning when the Vikings conquered Ireland or part of it and set up an independent government, which the English conquered in about 1100. But there is a period of hundreds of years where England successfully repressed Ireland and profited from the agricultural supplies that Ireland provided to England. England tried to stamp out the Catholic religion, the Irish language, unsuccessfully, but they had reduced Ireland by a point in the early 1800s where Irishmen could not vote unless they were Protestant or had allegiance to the King of England. Many could not own land. A lot of the land had been taken over by descendants of Cromwell's soldiers who had conquered Ireland in the 1600s. And so there was a point then where Irish nationalism was beginning to arise, and an effort was being made to declare that Ireland should be independent of England, politically independent at least. And so when Meagher was born in 1823, the beginnings of Irish nationalism were occurring. But the prevailing thought initially was that this was a slow and gradual process that would take time to occur. It would be a peaceful process, but it would take a long time. Meagher was born, into very fortunate circumstances. His grandfather had ships that brought supplies from salted cod from Newfoundland to Ireland, and products and people from Ireland to Newfoundland. His father, Thomas Marr Jr., was a partner in that company. They were very well to do, and Marr's father eventually became a member of the British Parliament. He was elected and became a member of Parliament. But Marr must have really been an orator and a gift for oratory. I've quoted or given you two of his famous speeches, which are called, one is the sword speech and the other is the dock speech, which are famous. So let me ask, is the Thomas Marr Bar in Missoula still operating? Anybody know about the Thomas Marr Bar? Nobody will admit knowing the Thomas Marr Bar. Okay.
It is operating.
It is operating. What is it like?
Very popular place.
All right, good. So Marr starts out, he's born in 1823. He goes to England for proper English education. He comes back in 1843. He's 20 years old. He's called the Prince of Waterford, and he immediately begins speaking on behalf of Irish nationalism, except that he does not agree that Irish nationalism should be a long-term peaceful thing. He begins speaking in much more forceful terms that, based on the model of the American Revolution, that picking up the sword and using it to achieve independence is not a bad thing, and because the principle of independence justifies the use of force. And that was the point of the so-called sword speech, which he gave in, I believe, 1846, and that established his reputation as one of the leaders of the young Islanders who believed that sooner or later there was going to have to be a revolution to achieve Irish independence. That was one strand that was occurring beginning before the potato famine. There was a increasing interest in achieving Irish independence, but the potato famine, which began to occur in 1845, made that whole situation really worse. The potato crop failed. As a result, Irish people were starving. There was plenty of food that was being grown, and animals and so on that were being shipped to England, and the English government did not do anything to improve the situation so far as Irish people were concerned. So that whole issue as to the fact that the English government should be doing something to deal with the problems of Irish starvation became an increasingly important factor in the push for Irish independence. There were a number of people who were involved in this cause. One of them was a young woman named Jane Francesca Elgee. I talk about her at pages 8 and 9. She was a Protestant from a family of loyalists, but she decided that she would support Irish nationalism and became known as the poetess Speranza, and wrote a famous poem, which I've excerpted at pages 8 8-8, 8-9, and included in the appendix, expressing outrage that the Irish people were starving and that nothing was being done. Two interesting things about her, I guess. One is that when Meagher was exiled to, or transported to Tasmania, he had a boat which had the name Speranza on it, which undoubtedly referred to her. And she, after he was transported, married a doctor named Wilde, and their younger son was Oscar Wilde, the famous Irish playwright. And she continued to be active politically after Meagher had left. So Meagher begins to become more active in leading Irish rebellion. The British government adopts increasingly restrictive treason statutes. Meagher and others are convicted of sedition and treason and sentenced initially to being hung, beheaded, quartered, which is pretty serious business. And while on the dock is the place where prisoners are located, he gives the famous dock speech to the judges and the audience there, which the audience at least thinks is wonderful, but the judges are not impressed. And so Meagher is transported, but Meagher's sentences and the sentences of others are commuted by Queen Victoria, and he is instead transported to Australia. So he had a real reputation as one of the emerging leaders of the Young Irelander movement in Ireland before he got transported to Australia. He lived there for about 3 years. He met and married a woman named Catherine Bennett, who was a free citizen of Australia. They had a child, and initially Meagher enjoyed the life of a country squire, I guess, in Australia, but he became increasingly restless and wanted to escape. He had a gentleman's agreement with the authorities that he would not attempt to escape. In turn, he was permitted relatively free movement on that island. But he decided to escape. He told the authorities he was going to escape. He agreed with his wife that she would come separately after he had left. And so he ends up in New York with his wife in Australia. Before he gets to New York, their young child dies. Benny, the wife, goes to Ireland, and she and Meagher's father come to visit him in New York. Meagher had become, or his reputation was such that he was immediately a celebrity in New York. He was an accomplished public speaker. He became a lawyer, but he decided, I guess it's true, that he could make better money being a public speaker on a lecture circuit than practicing law. And so he was a polished, professional, apparently charismatic speaker on the subject of Irish independence to people who, many of his audience were Irish immigrants, because the effect of the repressive British policies and the potato famine and starvation caused a lot of Irish, that was the cause of the Irish immigration to the United States in the late 1840s into the 1850s, 1860s. And but that Irish nationalist feeling was really very strong during those years. By it turned out that Mar's wife, Benny, did not like New York, did not like Mar's lifestyle of public speaking and traveling. She went back to New York, back to Ireland. She had become pregnant again. She died in that pregnancy. Her child survived. I don't know that Mar ever saw him because the child was in Ireland, and Mar could not go to Ireland because he'd been exiled from Ireland when he was transported. But he met another woman, Elizabeth Townsend, who remained his wife for the rest of his life, who was the daughter of a wealthy New York Protestant family, and supported him loyally throughout the rest of his life. Mar's initial feeling about, and you have to consider this in relation to the times, that slavery was becoming increasingly a national issue during the 1850s. Initially, Mar did not oppose slavery because it was it was permitted by the United States Constitution. The Irish point of view on slavery was that, if blacks were freed, they would compete with Irish immigrant workers, and therefore Irish people generally were not abolitionists. They tended to be New York Democrats who were not abolitionists. That became more the role of the Republican Party as it emerged beginning in 1856. But Mar had a newspaper in New York in 1856. He traveled. He was in Costa Rica for a year in 1860 to help or try to develop a route across the isthmus in Costa Rica. But in 1861, after the timing here is that Lincoln was elected president in November 1860. The South begins to secede. By the time Lincoln becomes president in March 1861, the Confederate state has established. April 1861, the Civil War begins with Fort Sumter. And at that point, then Mar decides that there should be an Irish brigade or contingent that would fight on the side of the Union against the South, which was then more aligned with England. And so the idea was that by fighting the South, the Irish would be preparing themselves to fight against England at some other time. And that was part of the basis for recruiting Irish immigrants to that brigade to begin with. That brigade, again, Mar's oratory was successful in recruiting people to fill that brigade. It started in late 1861, early 1862. Mar became a brigadier general, a politically appointed brigadier general as responsible for this brigade, and it fought in a number of major battles during 1862, 1863. There was the Battle of Fair Oaks in June 1862. There were other battles in June and July 1862. The result was that the Irish Brigade was suffering really heavy casualties, and Mar had to go back and try to recruit more people to fill the ranks of those who had been killed in the prior battles. But he reached a point where by 1863, he just couldn't see any more reason to recruit Irishmen for the brigade, because they were certainly going to be killed. And so he resigned in May 1863 as the Brigadier General of the brigade, but continued as a general in the army and had other assignments before he was finally cashiered and released in March of 1865. So he had all of that experience before coming to Montana. He was going to ask President Lincoln for an appointment to some office in one of the Western territories, but Lincoln was assassinated. That was not possible. Meagher went on his own out towards Minnesota, and he was then appointed territorial secretary of the territory of Montana, which had been created in 1864. And so he was coming to Montana as the second in command, as the territorial secretary. What he didn't anticipate is that the first governor of Montana, Sidney Edgerton, was planning to leave as soon as Meagher showed up. Meagher arrived in Bannock in September 1865. Apparently, at that point, Edgerton and his family were waiting to take the same stagecoach out of town that Meagher had come in on, leaving Meagher to be the acting governor, and in a situation where the territorial capital had just moved from Bannock to Virginia City, because by that time the placer mining in Virginia City had really boomed, and that's where a majority of the people were at that time. So, and here I guess I have to talk about Wilbur Sanders. I don't know if Wilbur Sanders' great-granddaughters are still in the class, but let me talk about Wilbur Sanders a little bit. I mentioned,
am here.
You are here.
Just
okay.
me. I'm the only one.
All
But
right.
Robin and I spoke
Pardon
with
me?
Robin and Claudia. They know I'm taking this class, so.
Okay. Well, let's talk about Wilbur Sanders, and you can correct me if I'm mistaken here, but to kind of do it step by step. We started along this line several weeks ago. Wilbur Sanders was Sidney Edgerton's nephew. He was, he was younger. He had practiced law with Edgerton in Ohio. He came out with Edgerton. Wilbur Sanders' family and Edgerton's family came out together to Bannock in 1862, because Edgerton was to be the Chief Justice of the Idaho Territorial Supreme Court. But Edgerton never got to Lewiston, Idaho because of the winter. He never became Idaho Supreme Court Justice. He instead was asked to lobby Congress to form a new territory, the Montana Territory, because of the number of people who were in the Bannock, Virginia City area who thought they should have their own territory. So Edgerton and Sanders go off to Washington in early 1863 or 4, I guess, and lobby Congress to cause the Montana Territory to be formed. But the other thing that Sanders did was that, as he was a lawyer, but there were no courts, there was no court system. And so he became the chief prosecuting lawyer for the vigilantes in Virginia City. And they were, I think, mostly Republican. They kept the territory in law and order. They unilaterally tried and convicted people who they thought were criminals and hung them without any court process or due process. And Sanders and the other vigilantes resented Marr's efforts to create a real territorial government, which included having a territorial legislature that would pass laws for the new territory. So, and I'm sure that Virginia City is a relatively small town at this point, and Sanders and Marr become well acquainted, and Marr gets no respect from the vigilantes. They consider him to be the acting one. He's not really the governor. So Edgerton's the governor, and they oppose him at every turn. They try to persuade Marr not to convene a legislature because they know that the legislative members are going to be primarily working class Democrats, and but Marr schedules the legislature anyway. It passes 40-some laws, and then Sanders goes back to Washington, D.C., and persuades Congress to invalidate all of those laws in early 1867. Now, and meanwhile, there's just a campaign against Sanders personally, against Marr, personally threatening him on behalf of the vigilantes and warning that he's going to get killed. There's someone who Marr had granted clemency to, who was hung with his clemency paper in his pocket. So there was this unending feud between Marr's efforts to achieve a government in the Virginia territorial government in the Virginia City area, and the vigilantes' efforts to continue to keep things as they were, because I think that the vigilantes could not retain control if there was a political system in place. And so there was a determination to void whatever Marr had done, and then to bring in, when it was clear that Edgerton was not going to come back, he'd gone back to Ohio, to bring in another radical Republican who would put back to law and order, who was a man named Green Clay Smith. So Green Clay Smith comes in as territorial governor, and he's appointed in mid-1866, comes into Virginia City by about September 1866, which puts Marr back to being the territorial secretary again. He's no longer acting governor. But Smith only stays for about 3 months, and he goes back east, where it's a little unclear, but he leaves and doesn't come back until July 1867. So there is a question, as to what was Green Clay Smith doing in the East, and was he aligned with Sanders in trying to invalidate the territorial legislative laws that the territorial legislature had adopted? It is, I became aware a couple of years ago that a historian named, Bruce Gurley, is a scholar about Green Clay Smith. He had given a presentation to the Montana Historical Society annual convention in 2019. And so I wanted to know, why did Green Clay Smith leave Montana to go to Washington, D.C. for 6 months? Or did he go there, and what did he do? And what Gurley told me, and which I've reported in at page 22 of my chapter, is that he was advocating on behalf of Montana for Eastern businessmen seeking investment in Montana. There's no indication that he was working together with Sanders in Washington, D.C. particularly. He was all over the East, so in a number of different states. But I found a couple of articles that were published in the Virginia City paper in early 1867 that Smith had been, as the governor, had been asked by the legislature to go to Washington, D.C. to try to get more money and supplies for the territory because Montana was not getting enough in money or supplies, either for its government or to fight the Indians who were still in the area. So, I could not resolve this when I was having an email exchange with Gurley about Green Clay Smith, and I pointed out to him that I had seen those newspaper articles about Smith going to Washington, D.C. to lobby on behalf of the Montana government. He stopped communicating with me, so I don't know. That's one of those mysteries. But in any event, Sanders lobbied Congress to invalidate the laws that the territorial legislature had passed, which is, on the face of it, is outrageous. So Sanders is gone all of this time. He leaves also in early 1867 and is in Washington, D.C. for this period of time. Finally, in about June 1867, Meagher decides to go to Fort Benton to pick up some back pay and pick up an arms shipment that's supposed to arrive to help the territory deal with the Indians. He meets up with Sanders on the streets of Fort Benton the day before he dies, and there's some exchange between them. Meagher at this point is not in good health. He's had some illness along the way. He knows a riverboat captain who had a riverboat there. He decides to spend the night on the riverboat, and about 10:30 that night, there's a yelling and some sort of sounds are heard, and at that point, Meagher is either jumped, pushed, or falls overboard, swept down the river and drowned. And nobody knows who did it. There was suspicion that Sanders caused it, but that was never established. And but that was a story that Sanders and his family proposed the story that Meagher had in effect fallen overboard or was drunk or something, and Sanders had nothing to do with it. But Paul Wiley, who wrote the book about General Meagher, decided to do a coroner's inquest, as a mock coroner's inquest in 2012 with a jury and presenting all the evidence. And the jury concluded that Sanders was responsible for Meagher's death. And I don't know the details of that. Wiley's book was written before that mock inquest occurred, so the book wouldn't cover that. But So that's the story of Sanders and Meagher. Sanders continued to be active in Montana politics. He was, as I think I mentioned the last time we talked about this, he was one of the first two senators elected when Montana became a state, elected by the way that worked is that Montana became a state. Montana legislature was elected. There was a Republican majority in the legislature that elected Sanders to in second place to a 3-year term. That term expired in 1893. The legislature in 1893 had multiple votes on who should replace him. It was deadlocked. Finally, Sanders was replaced by Lee Mantle as the Republican nominee for that position. The legislature was still deadlocked, adjourned. The governor appointed Mantle, and that was refused by the Senate, United States Senate, because he had been appointed by a governor instead of being elected by the legislature. So the whole effect of that was to leave that Senate seat open then for the next 2 years until there was another election. So, that sort of brings into question, what was the role of the vigilantes and were they justified in what they did? Sanders had a daughter-in-law, Helen Sanders, who wrote a 3-volume history of Montana in about 1912. I've seen those volumes. They're remarkable. You could not believe that a state that young could produce a 3-volume history, but she did. And the general position was that the vigilantes were justified in what they did. And if people got in the way, that was too bad, because they probably had it coming to them anyway, and that was the best that could be done in an otherwise lawless situation. So that's my take on Meagher and Sanders, except to say that yes, comments.
For the others.
I'd be interested in your comments.
Well, I have Helen Sanders was my grandmother.
Mhm.
I have one of the volumes. I don't have the complete set, and I don't know how they vanished, but they must have been dispersed between the children. And she wrote a lot about Montana history. She was very involved with Native Americans and Native American rights. In fact, she was made an honorary member of the, I think, Salish Kootenai tribe. But she was also a very troubled woman with a lot of problems. And by the time I was born, she and my grandfather were divorced, and she went and lived the rest of her life in New York City. But she was, she was very, very into Native American lore, wrote books about that. So yeah, she, and I know she was, extremely, but probably rightfully, or, because she was married into the family, very supportive of Wilbur Fisk and his legacy. He was famous mostly as a vigilante for being the prosecutor who hanged Henry Plummer, who was the sheriff, and who ran a gang of outlaws, underneath him, who robbed stagecoaches.
Right.
And when the vigilantes finally caught up with him, and they did hang him, and but they had what they would call a trial. And there were a lot of Henry Plummer's associates there, so it was dangerous to stand up to them. But Wilbur Fisk was famous for saying, "Men, do your duty," and so Henry Plummer was hanged.
And there were a lot of other people who were hanged also.
Oh yeah, there were. The vigilantes history is anything but clean, but those, for many years, even with K. Ross Toole's histories, Wilbur Fisk was a very honored part of Montana history.
Mm-hmm.
I think more recently, things have, new revelations have come out, and it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, it certainly was a troubled time, and I guess the final part of that is what I talked about before, is that there was still this current of Irish nationalism that persisted, and when Daly began to hire Irish miners and the Irishmen began to conflict with the Republican associations, there was a statue that was paid for by Butte miners principally, and that was the statue that was dedicated to Marr in Helena on July 4th, 1905, when just before Wilbur Sanders died. And what Egan says in his book was that Sanders could hear the crowds cheering for Marr and the Marr statue because his home was 2 or 3 blocks away from where they were doing this, and so maybe Marr had the last word posthumously in that way. So it's a fascinating history. So you kind of wonder, if Marr had not died or been killed, what would he have done? What would have become of him or the Irish movement in the United States? Because what Marr was trying to do, one thing that he was trying to do, was to set up a situation in Montana for Irish people, like Brigham Young had done in Utah for Mormons. Marr wanted to find a way to get the Irish out of New York City and into the West, where they could become farmers or have access to land, and he was never able to accomplish that because of his death. So, if he had lived, sort of think about how these timelines cross. Marr was killed in 1867. Daly came into Butte in 1876, and by 1881, Daly was beginning to hire Irish immigrants to work as miners for the Anaconda Company in Butte, and so it is possible that Marr's and Daly's paths would have crossed, and the Irish might have had an even stronger presence in Montana than they did. Are there any other comments, questions before we conclude? Okay, well, I'm running a little bit behind the curve here, but what I'd like to do next time is to talk about Burton K. Wheeler and Mike Mansfield, and then conclude with a discussion about where is Montana going? What is its path forward based on the Jared Diamond chapter that I've given you in supplemental material. So if there's a comment here, I'll just have to read. I appreciated the samples of Marr's oratory. Holds up well. Well, when you read it, it's pretty strong stuff, but you can imagine that if it's declaimed, not just read, but spoken forcefully as an orator would speak, I can't do that, but he could. Apparently it has a real power to move people because he had the power of words. And, who knows where that would have taken him if he had not made that unfortunate detour into Montana and ended his life prematurely. So thank you very much for participating today, and we'll do this one more time next week, and I'll look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Paul. Bye, everyone.